Greetings, this is your new Pan-African show called AfreeQa with your host Qetselaworq Seifu. Today we have traveled far into Tor Hailoch to find a school that has actually touched our interest. I am going to allow him to introduce himself.
My name is Panos H. I am the head of school and general manager of Lebawi Academy.
So we would like to say welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Who is Panos and what is he passionate about?
Very interesting question. Panos was born and raised in Addis back in the mid-60s. I was born in 1965 and I was born in Gulale area of Addis, but lived in different parts of Addis. Went to school at St. Joseph from KG to 12th grade. And then I left for the US during the difficult times right after during the Red Terror era. So just a simple person, born and raised in Addis, middle class family background that went to the US, got educated and came back to Ethiopia. I'm passionate about people in general, human beings, what does it mean to be human? Psychology, and education are my two main interests.
Okay. What made you want to open a school? Now, I'm sorry, I'm jumping, just so we can make the question interesting.
That's fine, yeah. So, like I said while I was introducing myself, I left Ethiopia during a time when things were not politically very stable. So I left against my will, so to speak. I didn't want to leave Ethiopia, but I finished high school and then things were not stable. So some people left the country through Djibouti, some through Sudan. I have a little bit of a Greek background, so I took on a Greek passport and went to Greece for about 3-4 months, lived there, and then went to the States to attend college. So when I was in college, I wanted to study economics, but I took a psychology course, Introduction to Psychology. And when I took that course, it became very evident to me that there were a lot of things that I needed to process. The civil unrest in Ethiopia, leaving family back home, my friends, some were actually assassinated. There was a lot of trauma that needed to be dealt with, particularly when I compared myself with my American counterparts of the same age. It became evident that I had lived a much longer life than most of them. So I went into psychology and studied psychology very, very deeply. I found it to be very interesting and helpful to me in terms of dealing with my own trauma. But the more I studied psychology, a couple of master's degrees after my first degree, and moved into a PhD program in clinical psychology and community psychology and organizational psychology. I explored a wide range of different aspects of psychology. I understood that this psychology was not complete for me. It didn't speak to me. I just had a sense that something was missing. And that's when Professor Darrell Rowe, an African-American professor, came into my life as one of my advisors. And he turned me on into African psychology. He used to travel to Ghana quite a bit, looking for tracing his own roots. And so when I started reading African psychology, African American psychology, bing, the light went on. All of a sudden, psychology was complete for me. It was as though I was, talking to myself, if you will. The psychology spoke about me and of me and my perspectives that Western psychology could not complete. This was the missing piece. And then another professor, Jose Cervantes, turned me on to the literature around indigenous psychology, particularly Native American psychology, and went into practice with him for about 6 months and studied that for some time. Then I understood that as Africans, we have our own psychology, our own perspective, our own history, and so then I became whole again, to some extent. The fragmented pieces were being pulled together, if you will.
Before you go any further, I'm sorry, I think we should point out the difference between Western psychology and African psychology.
Fundamentally, Western psychology comes out of and tries very hard to be within the tradition of the scientific method. Okay, so the scientific method, you hypothesize, you test your hypothesis, you prove or disprove assumptions, and you go through that process, right? So it's very linear and materialistic, if you will. So in that sense, there were areas that it cannot touch. The tools that Western psychology employs are insufficient to understand the human being in his or her complete sense. You know, the sense of spirituality, the metaphysical aspect. So to me, that was the missing piece. And then also the relationship with community, because Western psychology came out of the Western cultural perspectives that emphasized individuality and individualism. So our sense of community, our sense of bond with others, our sense that how we derive meaning of life through others. You know, Western psychology says, I think, therefore I am. In Africa, we say, I am because you are, you know, Ubuntu. And so these elements are not present in Western psychology. So, but a lot of good stuff happens in Western psychology as well, particularly when it comes to technique, and you know, working with people, etc. So that was the added piece for me. So that was happening on one end. Right around that time, I also met a person who wanted to open a school. And he wanted to open a school that was focused on closing the gap between potential and access. His name is Hadis Tadessa, and he used to say that he was never a very smart student. He was an average student. But because things were aligned and he had an opportunity to go to good schools, he was able to uncover his own potential, bring it out, and you know, live a very fulfilling life. And so there are a lot of students in Ethiopia who have the potential, but they don't have access to good education that allows them to bring it out. So when he approached me to form a board and kind of start the school together, it really resonated because my father, my late father, was an orphan, and people in the neighborhood around the Jachube Safar and Doromanek, that's where he grew up, raised him, people in the neighborhood. And when he was around 14, he was asked to stop going to school and go to work because the girls in his stepdad's home, the girls had to go to school. So he stopped going to school and he became a delivery boy at the very first branch of the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia in Piazza. So one day he was at his job and the late Emperor Haile Selassie comes to visit the bank and he sees him and he says, what's going on? So my dad tells him his story and the emperor says, okay, you have to go to school. So you will go to our school in Kotabe, and the school was designed to bring students from around the country. And when you finish high school, you'll go back to the bank and you'll serve the bank. So my dad did that, went back, served the bank for 35 years, and you know, he rose through the ranks and he was the third in line below Dr. Tafara Dagafe and Dr. Manase Lama, the giants of Ethiopian banking. So he was among those who kind of established the banking system. But I grew up hearing this story, and I spent my Saturdays and Sundays in the Jachube Safar and Doromanek. There were people who didn't get this chance that remained in those neighborhoods. So they became family. You know, we're not related by blood, but you know, that's your uncle, that's your aunt, and they're very, you know, humble people and low economic background. And so these are my people, these are my cousins and my aunts and my uncles and all that stuff. So to open a school that gave scholarship to students who had potential but didn't have access was a homecoming for me. It was like completing the circle. So it was a no-brainer. So I joined the effort and we formed a board and we started the process. psychology and indigenous psychology by the time this was happening. Okay. So the two kind of merge in the opening of the school and what we did thereafter. So if I may say, this is a book. My dad was a public speaker also. So this is a collection of his speeches. So I'd like to give you this as a gift.
Beautiful, thank you.
For doing this interview with me.
The Banker Speaks.
The Banker Speaks. And this is the story that I just told you.
Yes.
About the emperor meeting him.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. My next question would be, what does Lebawi Academy mean? Is it related to the philosophy of the school? And
Yes.
what is the philosophy behind Lebawi Academy's way of education?
So Lebawi, the word itself comes from the Ge'ez word Lebawa.
Okay.
Okay? Lebawa in Amharic, asta'ala, tamrammara, uqatan, unatin, kalbushata. So in other words, Lebawa means to seek truth and knowledge from the heart.
Okay.
So in African ontology, okay, it is said that only human beings are bestowed with this authority among all of creation.
Right.
Okay, so Lebawi, to seek truth and knowledge from the heart, in other words, means to be human, to become human. So when we started the school, we asked fundamental questions about what does education mean? Okay, how do you differentiate the educated from the uneducated? What's the Ethiopian philosophy of education? Modern education, that is. So we did research for about 7 years, and we couldn't really find a comprehensive philosophical foundation for Ethiopia's modern education. Although prior to Minilik School, around 1897, that opened, prior to that, there was teaching and learning processes in the country for centuries. But that pedagogy, that way of teaching and learning was put aside, and a new foreign idea of education was implemented. So we learned that for generations, the quest to have an Ethiopian philosophical foundation for education was not answered. So we had to go back and say, okay, we have to have a framework. It's not about just opening a school. We asked the question, this thing called education, who are we giving it to? We're giving it to students. What are students? Human beings. Well, what does it mean to be human? So we had to go back to this African ontology of what it means to be human. So we studied people like John Mbiti on African philosophies and religions, renowned experts. And what they tell us is that from an African perspective, there is the creator, there is the invisible world, there is animals and plants, and then there is events and phenomena. And below the creator, there is the human being, with the authority to seek and look for knowledge and wisdom and truth. The Ethiopian philosopher Zara Yacob calls it Nikata Helina, or in other words, consciousness. For example, a lion who would kill a wild beast for lunch, after completing his lunch, wouldn't sit under the sun and say, she may have a family, she may have kids, and I may have hurt the family, right? But a human being is bestowed with the capacity to examine himself or herself, if you will. 1. 2, each individual, for example, Qetsu, has inherited something from her father, Ato Seifu. She has inherited some things from her mother, Waizaro Ileni Mokrea. If there is religion, there's the perspectives that she's gotten from religion. Where you grew up, there are things that you got from your siblings, brothers and sisters, the schools that you attended, the things that you've studied. All these things combined give Qetsu a particular voice that has never been, that doesn't exist outside of her, and that will never exist in the future. The earth is inhabited with 8 billion people. But Qetsu's voice is Qetsu's voice. Right. Panos has his, and each individual has his and hers, right? So that also makes the human different than other creations, if you will. So when we bring that down to education, okay, if each individual is created in this very unique way, then education has to be a tool that each individual uses to find that unique voice In Ethiopian philosophy, it's called Nabbawinat with an N. Okay. Nabbawi. Yandandaችን ያለን ልዩ ነገር, you know. To bring that, to look for that unique voice, bring it out, and use it as a tool to live an examined, meaningful life. So if education doesn't meet that standard, it doesn't hold up to the majesty or the wonder of human capability, if you will. Okay? So most of the education that we see throughout the world, actually, is not of that particular standard, if you will. It's information, it's data, it's creating professionals who do certain things, but it doesn't go to the core of what it means to be human and how to bring out that unique voice in every human being, right? So this African ontological framework of what it means to be human informs the Lebawi way. So from that, we have ways of implementing it. Okay. For example, one of our values is self-examination. That assignment of examining oneself is given not only to teachers, but to administrators and students, the entire community. So the assignment that I've been given is, as a head of school, am I in this world, the way I go about doing my work, the way I go about relating with others, the way I speak, the way I come in and out of different contexts, does it meet this idea that the sanctity of human life and the height that human beings can reach? Is it reflective of that? So that's an assignment given to me, right? And to every student and to every teacher within our compound. So we create the culture that way. The other one is creativity. Creativity for us is problem solving. So I encounter a lot of problems in my day-to-day engagement with, you know, a host of different situations, right? So how am I creatively solving these problems is the question. And the third one is Ubuntu, which is without the teacher, there is no student. Without the student, there is no teacher, you know. So these things kind of create the value system. And then how it happens, the enzyme that make it happen is, for example, this is an interaction. The first is interact. This is an interaction between myself and you. After the interaction, we're also having an interaction with the audience. After the interaction, at Lebawi, what we do is there's a purposeful time and space that we create to do reflection. Okay, what did we learn from the interaction? Did I explain the philosophy of the school well? What could have I said differently? What did I learn from the interviewer? What did I learn from the whole experience, etc.? So that's the reflection. So interaction, reflection, and as a result of the interaction and reflection, there is a becoming. So it's a spiral, it's action research. We do, we learn, and we grow and we develop. So that cycle is repeated in everything that we do, okay, aligned with the philosophy. We call that the Lebawi way. So we come in as human beings, and every student comes in as a human being. As the students exit the system, there's a phase that we call modulation. Modulation is, without doubt, when the community you're a part of can say that, yes, he or she is living up to that ideal of what it means to be fully human. And you can't fake it.
No, unfortunately, no.
You can't fake it, yeah. The community, that's the African, in African systems, the community knows who's of that caliber and who's not. So hopefully, as students exit our system formally, that modulation phase is evidence that most of their friends, most of their teachers, administrators, etc., people in the community, think of them as a people or a person that is on that search of that unique voice. Some of them get it, some of them smell it, but they're onto their way to live a very examined, purposeful life. And to us, that's what education is. To find that unique voice, bring it out, implement it, and live a purposeful life, right? So that's the Lebawi way, as in a nutshell.
What is your philosophy behind the arts?
It's all integrated. We have a system called course integration.
Okay.
So course integration is a way of teaching. It's a way of teaching. It's a methodology of connecting every subject with other subjects. For example, if a physics instructor is teaching a unit on motion, and he goes into a class and he's talking about motion, he's encouraged to relate the idea of motion with various different subjects. What's motion in history? What's motion in poetry? What's motion in music? What's motion in biology, etc., right? So to us, knowledge is integrated in its natural existence. You know, for example, an Ethiopian farmer knows about agriculture, and on Sundays he's a preacher or a priest, if you will, so knows a little bit about theology. In times of war, he goes to war, so he knows something about military science. So knowledge doesn't exist in isolation, right? It's all integrated. So in this modern setting, we attempt to do that in every subject. So the art is no different to us, right? It's a part and parcel of human expression and human knowledge. Right. So it has to be integrated. It is integrated in everything we do.
So what made you open a Pan-African school?
The idea is not to open a Pan-African school. The idea is to open a school. When you open a school, you have to ask certain questions, like I said earlier. What is education? Okay, what does it mean to be educated, right? And how do you differentiate the educated from the uneducated? Where do you get the answers from? You can't just borrow concepts, right? You have to go into your own psychological grounding and your own culture and your own history. And that's why we went into African ontology and studied what it means to be human, to start with, right? So for us, it's a very natural thing to do in terms of, the framework itself is African. The framework that I just explained is very African. So it's not to create an African school, it's to create a school, and we happen to be Africans who are in touch with our heritage and our philosophies and our perspectives. And so by default, the school becomes Pan-African, right? Yeah, but the good thing is that, an African ontology is inclusive by nature. Okay, it's human-centered, right? So it's inclusive, it's expansive. So even though it's a Pan-African school, it's also, we say, locally robust, globally connected. In Amharic, we say, ኢትዮጵያዊነት ላይ የተመሰረተ ዓለም አቀፋዊ አስተሳሰብ. So in other words, our students, for example, not the students, let me use you as an example. Kazu is not Ethiopian today, African tomorrow, and a global citizen the day after. Right. She's Ethiopian, African, and a global citizen because she's a human being simultaneously, all at once, all the time, right? So education has to also, in Ethiopia, have Ethiopian elements to it across the board, African elements to it across the board, and non-African elements, broader global perspective, because our students are also human beings who live in this world, right? So it's a very natural thing to do. One of the things that we found out when we did research for 7 years in terms of what has been done in the education space in Ethiopia is that the so-called international schools, for example, they focus, if it's British, it's very British.
Exactly.
But there's nothing Ethiopian or African about it. If it's French, it's very French. So if it's American, it's very American, right? So an Ethiopian child who goes to the French school cannot be fully human. Because their Ethiopianness, their Africanness is compromised. Their global perspective, French, is there, okay? But there will be missing pieces, right? So Lebawi is an experiment and an attempt to correct the errors that have been made so that our youth come out and develop in their formative years being fully human, solid in their understanding of who they are as Ethiopians in the African context and in the global context. So we're not out there creating a Pan-African school, we're creating a school and we're Africans, so we have an African ontology of how we understand what education is and what being human is. So I would frame it that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you lived in the US.
Yes.
What did you do in the US? Were you teaching in the US also, or did you finish your school and then come?
Yeah, so I was educated in the States. I got my first degree in psychology and sociology, my first master's in clinical psychology, and a second master's in community psychology, and a third master's in organizational psychology. And then I went into a PhD program in organizational psychology.
Okay.
So explored the space of psychology. And then I started doing psychotherapy with clients. So I had my own practice, and I did psychotherapy with individuals, with couples, with families, with kids for a number of years. And then I also worked as a community psychologist with inner city gang prevention programs in the city of Long Beach. So we would identify young people who were at risk of joining gangs and other unhealthy activities, and we would design programs to kind of help them navigate and find a better path, if you will. So I worked as a community psychologist for a while, and then I also worked as an organizational psychologist, a consultant, to help different teams and groups of people work effectively within organizations for some time. And then I caught the bug of teaching and went into academia. And once I started teaching, because I had spent a number of years in school, I remembered how much I had missed the campus environment. So I started teaching part-time in the evenings, and then I stopped my daytime job and went fully into teaching at the university level. And then I became a professor. I was tenured. And a few years after my tenure completion is when I met Hadis, and we started talking about the school. And so I came back after 33 years to open the school in the year 2013.
Beautiful. So what unique skills do you think you bring to the education department? You know, doing what you have done abroad, coming to Ethiopia as a teacher, as a professor, as a director.
Unique to Ethiopia, or
within your school?
Within my school,
yes.
Okay. So I think one of the things that I've always admired the West is in their ability to organize, to plan, to execute, to market. Africa, the classical African problem is implementation. We have great ideas, great inspiration, and when it comes to implementing ideas in this contemporary space, I see challenges. So I believe, having been grilled in the corporate space for quite some time and been trained to plan and organize and implement, I believe I bring some skill sets in that space. We've built the team from scratch, from zero. It was 5 of us that started the school. We had 2 rooms, borrowed rooms, at Hope University. One room was our office, one room was a classroom for 25 ninth graders that we identified from 10 different public schools. And when the ninth graders moved to the 10th grade, we added 25 more into the 9th grade, and then we hired 2 more people. We became 7. So we've been building the school that way, and currently we have 64 employees. We have graduated 150 students from high school. 50 students have graduated with their first degrees from Ivy League schools around the world. We've been able to spend $9 million in educating our students who are on the scholarship track. We started accepting paying students only 2 years ago. The school has been around since 2013. So everybody else that we educated, from 2 years back was on full scholarship. And currently, we have 275 students. 50% are on scholarship, 50% are paying. Our students have earned scholarship worth $7 million in Ivy League schools and other high-level institutions. So this requires a lot of organizing, a lot of planning, a lot of building the team. So I think I've contributed a little bit in that process, but obviously no work is done alone, right?
Absolutely.
So there's a team of people that have been very responsive to the call, if you will, to the Lebawi call, who've joined, and we've built a team over the years to accomplish this thing. So that would be one thing that I bring, but this may not be a skill set, but the other is, the philosophy of the school, that we tell the students there's something unique inside, bring it out. This job didn't allow me to do that, I would stop in a day. So I only do what's meaningful to me and what speaks to my heart and to my soul. So if that's a contribution of some sort, then I have that for sure.
I think the next question should be, what is a perfect teacher for you? What makes a standard teacher a good teacher?
What is teaching in its broadest sense, right? Not technically, but in a broad, what's a teacher? What's the teacher archetype, right? It's to teach is to help somebody come from darkness, if you will, to light. From death, if you will, to life. Right? It's to guide. It's to show the way. That's what to teach is, right? So for me, a good teacher is somebody who has made and is making that journey himself or herself. You have to go from point A to point B, or in that path, or be conscious about that path that you're taking in this regard. And also to show these things is not to give information, is to give clues. A good educator is this, somebody who does this. You have to do this.
You have to be able to.
You have to just, you have to show them, you have to give them something to see the path, to see another way, right? So it's to inspire, it's to guide. But in that process, one has to be immersed in that process himself or herself in their own path. So you do it in a very authentic way. You're not detached from that process yourself. Another thing is, when I did psychotherapy, this became very, very clear to me. Each time a client would come into my office, let's say I was struggling with finance in my life. The client would come in and say his issue is finance. Let's say I'm struggling with relationship. The client would come in and say he's struggling with relationship, right? So healing is reciprocal.
Right.
So is teaching. So a teacher has to be very willing and mindful of the fact that he or she is always learning from the student, and it's reciprocal, right? So it's not the expert, teaching, but it's a journey together, right? So if you have elements of these things within you, the rest is technique that you can learn.
Okay.
So that's how I would frame teaching in a good teacher.
What kind of standards do you have for teachers, or do you?
The main standard is the philosophy of the school itself, which is each person has a unique voice. And to be educated is to find that voice, bring it out, implement it, and live an examined life. If teaching is not that for you, then don't do it. Right? A physics instructor has to smell of physics. He has to breathe physics. Physics has to ooze out of his ears, because that's what he does, or that's what she does. See, so that's a basic standard. Like I said earlier, if this job doesn't allow me to be fully expressed in that sense, I will not do it for a day. And I shouldn't, because because it's not fair to me, it's not fair to people around me, right? So the first thing for teachers, the standard is that. Is teaching a calling, is teaching a passion, is teaching your voice. Are you finding that unique thing, unique voice within you through the space of, in the teaching learning process? Does it allow you to do that? Okay, are you using the space for that purpose? Okay, is the main standard. And then what I said earlier about good teaching is about knowing that teaching learning is reciprocal. Are you open for that? do you learn from your students? And along that side are you making that journey of self-discovery? Are you on that path? Are you uncovering the layers, from darkness to light, from death to life? Are you in that movement constantly? Are you conscious of that movement? Because that's what you're supposed to help students with, right? So these are the standards,
Sure.
It's a way of life. So if you're in that space, the rest, technique, classroom management, and all that stuff, we can teach you that stuff. It's not as complicated. It's a skill set that one can learn.
Very true. We've been talking very seriously so far, so I think we need to listen to music.
Yes.
And, February 21st was when Malcolm X was assassinated.
Yes.
And Mariam Makeba has actually sung about him. February being the month of African American month, right?
Yes.
So
Black History Month.
Black History Month.
Yes.
Can we call it African History Month?
We should.
Black is such a...
Yes.
So African History Month. So this is just because of what I just heard, I'm going to ask you this question. Does the school teach African History Month to their students? And the reason why I ask you is because I do a radio show, and I was playing African American music this week, actually for the last couple of weeks. And the second week yesterday I was asked, why am I not playing African music? Now, when the caller said that to me, I was like, but I'm playing African American music. Mm-hmm. He did not think.
The connection.
Exactly, he did not make the connection that these poor people were part of the African community.
Yes.
So I realized that in my case, I do play African music, but do I normally play the diaspora from the US or the Caribbean, even though they don't even think the Caribbeans? Needless to say, my question is...
Yes. Well, it's funny that you ask, because we're exploring that as a school as we speak.
Okay.
The connection. Okay. Every week we have what we call community meeting. So the entire school comes together for an hour of discussion on various topics. So the junior grades 5 to 8 do it on Wednesdays. The high schoolers 9 to 12 do it on Thursdays in the morning. So last week the conversation was around Black History Month. What it means. Is it American? Is it Caribbean? Can we celebrate Black History Month? And we explored that space. Okay. So very insightful ideas were coming up. So we're pointing, or we started that conversation because we're heading towards a particular agenda next week. So this week on Wednesday and Thursday, students will present on prominent Africans at home and abroad. Okay, in various spheres. The following week is Adwa. So when we celebrate Adwa, the main element of our Adwa celebration this year, and we do it every year, is the contribution of Adwa to Black History Month. So that connection has to be made.
Right.
Well, you and I both know that there's a long history and that connection is there.
Exactly.
But our textbooks don't tell us these connections are there. And actually, for a number of years, this disconnect has been made deliberately, if you will, right? So at Lebawi, that's how we're celebrating Black History Month, by linking it with Adwa and making these connections. And then every year, every student that joins Lebawi has to take a course in the summer on African studies.
Wow.
Okay, which includes Africans at home and Africans abroad. That's how we see it. So everybody has to take that course. We're currently thinking about doing a Pan-African class, a mandatory class for every grade level, and maybe next year something like that would materialize.
Lovely. So, do you have space for students from other African countries who might like the Pan-Ethiopian vision of Lebawi Academy to come?
Yes, we do. We've had some students from other parts of Africa in the past. Currently, I don't think we have any enrolled, but yes, the school
It's open.
is open for everyone, yes.
At Lebawi, we do it differently. I saw that on your website. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that?
One of the things that I think differentiates us from other schools is that for us, because of the philosophical foundation, when a student comes in, the question is not, can this student do this or that? The question for us is, what's the student's unique voice? So we come from this assumption that Native Americans call it original medicine. In Ethiopian philosophy, it's called Lebawi, that's right? We've talked about it earlier. So the school is designed to help students look for it, find it, bring it out, and implement it, and experiment while in school. So that when they reach the modulation phase, they have a sense of it. Some of them are there already, but at the very minimum, they have a sense of it, and it becomes a lifelong mission, right? So that's what to be educated means. There are a lot of professors who are uneducated. There are a lot of people who don't know how to read and write, but are highly conscious and aware and live a very fulfilling life. So for us to be educated is that. So I think that differentiates us from schools who focus on teaching students specific skills that will relate to employment. We do that too, but we do it in a grander scheme of things, right? So that differentiates us. Another differentiator is, when we did the research for 7 years, what we found in the Ethiopian school systems, educational institutions, was that, a person might be an excellent accountant that graduates from the Ethiopian school system, but if you ask him to stand in front of a group and express his thoughts, or if you ask him to organize a certain group of people and start an initiative and move the initiative forward, a lot of them struggle. So what we've done is, next to academia, we've created an entire program, and we call it the Leadership Center, Leadership Platform, Yamarinet Madrak, where soft skills are developed, and ability to work with others, and ability to navigate systems and to implement things. So within that, we have 7 or 8 different kinds of programs. Community meeting, community service, student clubs and organizations, lecture series, experiential learning. There's a whole gamut of programs that all students have to go through. So it's not just academics, it's not just identity formation, it's not just looking within to find your voice, but also it's about being able to work with people, being able to express your thoughts and sell ideas and navigate through systems, right? So it's very comprehensive in that sense. So that makes us unique as well. Another thing that differentiates us is we have started a school with an African ontological perspective that in the foundation and the framework itself comes from the African voice, African perspective, And I don't know of a lot of schools that do that. We've kind of mapped ourselves with a couple of other schools in the continent that are doing really good work, but they're not fundamentally responding to the questions of education and what it means to be educated from an African perspective, right? So we're disruptive in a way. We're disruptive. Yeah. And our disruptive approach also comes from critiques of education, people like Paulo Ferreira, who talked about amazing book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and talks about the education system as a legacy from the Industrial Revolution, where he links it, he says it's like a banking model, where something comes, you deposit, and the scope of the student is to contain that knowledge, and as needed, you withdraw from that deposit, and it's very dehumanizing. It's very dehumanizing. So an African ontological perspective that's human-based, human-centered, disrupts that and is a response to that universal crisis of education, which is a legacy of the Industrial Revolution, right? So all these things, I think, makes our experiment unique.
What are the indispensable tools for a great education? If someone from the Ministry of Education was listening to you right now, what could they do to make not necessarily your life, but people that are in the education field?
Make the education Ethiopian. Make it authentic.
የኛ ማለት ነው።
የኛ ይሁን. So the reason I say that is for a people to survive as a people
Right.
over a long period of time. Okay, when they exist to start with, as a people, they encounter problems, economic problems, political problems, health problems, food security, all kinds of different problems as a people, right? So to continue existing as a people for a long period of time means you've solved some of these problems to get from generation to generation to generation, right? So if you don't solve these problems, you'll cease to exist. So Ethiopia as a people, we've existed for a long period of time. So our fundamental question is, how did we do it? How do we solve problems, right? So there is knowledge, okay? So including knowledge about what education must be and what education is. So fundamentally, the whole framework and our philosophical foundation has to start from that. ቤት ከመሰረቱ. So once you do that, you can build on that. You know, the biggest problem that I see in the Ethiopian education system is it doesn't have a comprehensive philosophy that's Ethiopian. The not pre-modern education systems had precepts and elements of education that are very profound. I'll give you an example. In northern Shoa, remote place in the 16th century, this is what we gathered from our research. They used to differentiate two aspects of quote-unquote educated people. Balamoya and Awaki. Okay? So Balamoya is a guy who, for example, becomes an accountant, and he's a very good accountant. Awaki is somebody who comes up with new principles of accounting. Okay? So if we take Lalibela, for example, he built it from top down, not from foundation up. Defied all the rules. Still haven't figured out how he did it. Okay? So when it's authentic and when it's indigenous, right? You take that and you build. And then if there are elements that you need to add, there's no problem in adding. When the Persians and the Greeks used to travel through Ethiopia in the ancient times, it's said that they liked doing that because Ethiopia was a repository of knowledge from everywhere. So we're not against bringing in knowledge, okay?
True.
But you have to start from your own. So I would say, and there are some elements currently that are trying to indigenize the education system. There were efforts in the past. It was called Ethiopianization of the education system and all that stuff. It's good, but I think it needs to go a step further and answer the fundamental questions. What is education to begin with? Not as an economic imperative, but as a philosophical imperative to begin with. As a people, what does our psychology, what does our temperament, what does our history tell us what education is and what it must be? You know, that has to be seriously addressed. Otherwise, it's putting band-aids, and we're dealing with symptoms and not the root problem. The root problem for me that needs to be looked at is the fundamental question about what education is. How do you differentiate the educated from the uneducated? These things have to get adequate response.
Right.
An incredible amount of resource and time and effort has to be put forth into addressing that systematically.
Since we were talking about indigenous education and modern education, now every country, like you said, had their own way of educating before colonization.
Yes.
Now, after that, are there any schools around the continent that has actually put in the two together?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Lebawi.
Yes, we are the first.
You know, when we did research, we haven't been able to find schools.
Wow.
We haven't been able to find schools.
Wow, so that's a problem, isn't it?
It's a good problem to try to deal with. It's a good problem to try to deal with. And the problem is not that doesn't only exist, and if it does exist, we haven't come in contact with them.
Okay.
So I can't say it doesn't exist, but we haven't come in contact with them. But the bigger problem and the real problem to deal with on a daily basis is none of us grew up in an education system that did that. So at Lebawi, there is stuff we say maragaf. There are things that we have to shade off because we have to reorient ourselves, right? So that is a challenge that and a problem that we have to deal with on a daily basis. To do this kind of education and provide it to our students, we have to also be in that space.
Absolutely.
And we've been oriented and taught a certain way, right? So that self-examination value is put there for a reason. We have to constantly examine ourselves and how much we're off track and how much we have to dig in and all that good stuff. So, for example, at Lebawi, we have a department called Indigenous Science Department. So it's a space where all of us go to really learn and relearn some of the knowledge that exists in Ethiopia and in Africa, because in our upbringing, most of us haven't had the opportunity to explore that.
Wow. So it's been over 50 years since education has been around, modern education.
Mm-hmm.
Any lessons learned after 50 years?
Yes. We haven't fundamentally addressed some of the challenges and difficulties that we face as a people to the extent that we would like to.
Okay.
So in the early days of modern education, some of the things that became very evident in Ethiopia was the educated started being isolated from the quote-unquote uneducated. Those who were educated were removed from society, and this miscommunication started happening, etc. Right? So that's the problem of not having an indigenous, authentic foundation to your education. Right? It separates those who've accessed modern education and those who haven't, and then it creates divisions in society and all that stuff. So because of that, we haven't been able to really comprehensively understand what it means to be Ethiopian, what it means to be African, what it means to be human from our own perspective. We have borrowed concepts here and there, and then some come from the East, some come from the West. There's nothing wrong with that, only that we don't have a foundation of our own. So we're not adding, we're trying to replace, and it becomes very distorted, right? So I think we've learned that. I think the current interest and attempt by government and scholars to really force this agenda forward gives me some hope that a more serious look at this whole indigenization and of the process and asking the hard questions, the fundamental questions. There's hope in that process. The reason for example, you talked about the identity song, Burning Spears. When I was at the University of Washington and I got into African psychology and indigenous psychology, etc., I used to experiment with it with my students at the University of Washington, University of Cascadia. And it turned out to be one of the most popular classes that students, Americans would line up to and study, and I had a following, if you will, and we would study together and all that stuff. And it really showed me that is indeed the missing link, and that the African ontological perspective of what it means to be human could save humanity, if you will. And if we were to take these concepts and, like we're trying to do at Lebawi, really implement them from the foundation into everything, then there is hope. I truly believe that, because the things that modern education and the scientific method could not reach, we were able to explore in indigenous psychology and cultural psychology courses. And Westerners would just eat it up. They loved it. It was feeding a missing something within, right? So generally, as humans, there's much to be said about really indigenizing education. And I think as Ethiopians, as Africans, as the first people on the planet, we have the responsibility to do that for humanity.
Beautiful. So I heard you are a St. Joseph alumni.
Yes.
What can you tell us about your experience in St. Joseph in your school? Did you incorporate anything that you had liked or enjoyed in St. Joseph into Lebawi Academy?
So at St. Joseph, I was there from KG to 12th grade. There were kids whose parents were civil servants. There were kids whose parents were part of the royal family at one time and part of the new regime, ministers and all that stuff at one time. There were kids whose parents were merchants and business people. There were kids whose parents were not very well off economically and therefore they were given scholarship. And we all grew up together. So that sense of being able to relate with anybody is a very powerful educational tool. So St. Joseph really has given us that sense that you could talk to the minister's son as well as somebody that comes from a very low economic background and everyone in between and that kind of stuff. So that diversity of student population was incredibly powerful. At Lebawi, currently we have 50% paying students and 50% scholarship students, and I see the same kind of richness, and it's most schools don't afford you to have that kind of experience. So that's one. At St. Joseph, continuity was another profound element that I found. You know, teachers that taught St. Joseph students that were 10, 15 years older than me have also taught students that are 10, 15 years younger than me, right? So there's a culture, there's a school culture. So in terms of employee retention and continuity, there's a lot of elements that we took from there that I'm trying to also implement at Lebawi. Retention, we work on retention very, very carefully. All the department heads and the deans at Lebawi, for example, came in as part-time instructors and grew up in the Lebawi system. There's nobody that just comes, we all grow up and go through the system together, through the process. So that culture, school culture and philosophy becomes part of who you are, right? So that's another element. Another one is, we weren't too sheltered. We were allowed to experiment a little bit. We used to get into fights and that kind of stuff, and it was okay. Everything was not frowned upon. It's life. So a sense of, you have to find your way, and all that has helped us in later years, both in Ethiopia and abroad, to kind of have a sense of self-confidence, and you go for it, and you do whatever you have to do. I particularly enjoyed. I was part of the school team, soccer, and I played a lot of football, we called it. Before my American days, I call it soccer now. And then I was part of the music scene. I was a vocalist, so I used to sing in a band. So these are very fond memories and good things that I think I've gotten from my St. Joseph experience. Yes.
Beautiful. Well, Qetselaworq Seifu, as the host of the Pan-African show, AfreeQa, wants to say thank you for allowing us to come to this beautiful compound and actually show off your school. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me.